I still remember that Tuesday morning like it was yesterday. The air was crisp, with the leaves just starting to change color, signaling the start of fall. Sarah had already left for work when my phone buzzed with her name flashing on the screen. "Hey," she started, her voice carrying that familiar hint of frustration that usually accompanied minor inconveniences. "The truck's making this weird noise again. It's coming from somewhere under the hood, and I have no idea what it could be. Can you help?" Sarah and I had been married for 10 years. We'd met back in college at a mutual friend's party. She had this infectious laugh and a down-to-earth nature that drew me in right away. We'd been through so much together, ups and downs, job changes, family losses. I was confident in our relationship, and over the years, I'd become accustomed to her quirks, including her tendency to panic at the smallest car troubles. If it wasn't the mysterious clanking that turned out to be a loose water bottle rolling under the seat, it was the squealing noise that ended up being nothing more than a loud brake pad. I had always tried to be patient with her, even when she overreacted. "All right," I told her, keeping my tone even. "I can give you the address of a shop I know nearby. Mike runs it, remember him? I'll call and let him know you're coming in. He's reliable, he'll get it sorted out fast, and I'll meet you there later on. If it's a quick fix, I'll just bring another car and take the truck home myself." Sarah agreed, thanking me, though I could hear her impatience at the inconvenience in her voice. Mike and I went back a few years, and his shop had always been dependable. I trusted him to handle any issue with my vehicles. Over the years, I'd sent him a fair share of business, even recommending him to friends and family. Mike was a hard-working guy with a straightforward approach to his work. While we weren't exactly close friends, I considered him a trusted acquaintance, a guy who took his job seriously and didn't cut corners. After giving Sarah the details, I figured everything would go smoothly, and I'd meet her there in a few hours. I thought it would be a simple matter of checking out the truck, paying the bill, and moving on with our day. But in hindsight, there had been something strange about her call that I couldn't shake. I brushed it off as just my imagination, something fueled by her annoyed tone, and returned to my work, leaving any suspicions unspoken. The morning dragged on, and as the clock edged closer to noon, I started wrapping up my tasks, preparing to leave the office early to meet her. The plan was to drive over in our second car, a reliable, low-maintenance sedan, which we mostly kept for situations like this. I felt reassured knowing Sarah was in good hands with Mike, but a nagging sense of unease lingered at the back of my mind. I shook it off, thinking I was just paranoid. Why would anything be wrong? We'd been through our share of rocky patches, but I'd always considered our relationship rock solid at its core. Finally, I left the office, letting my assistant know I'd be out for the rest of the day. My drive to the shop was uneventful, yet somehow tense. Traffic was unusually heavy, which added to my frustration and built up the anxiety gnawing away inside. As I sat in the bumper-to-bumper crawl, I couldn't help but think about Sarah, waiting in the shop lobby, probably fuming at the delay. It wasn't like her to handle these kinds of things on her own, and I knew she'd rather be doing anything else than waiting around for a car repair. By the time I reached the shop, the clock had ticked past 1, and I was more than ready to get this over with. I pulled up outside and noticed my Ford F-150 parked neatly near the entrance. It looked perfectly fine, as if nothing had ever been wrong with it. My first thought was that the issue must have been minor, maybe just a loose part or an old belt that needed replacing. I was relieved, assuming the repair was complete, but as I scanned the area, I realized something strange. Sarah and Mike were nowhere in sight. I walked into the lobby, where the smell of motor oil and rubber filled the air. It was a familiar scent, one that always brought to mind the countless times I dropped by to get our vehicle serviced. The front desk was empty, which was unusual. Normally, there was always someone at the counter, ready to greet customers and handle paperwork. I called out, but there was no response. The quietness was unnerving, and for the first time, I felt the unease that had been sitting in the back of my mind grow into something more concrete, a sense that something wasn't right. Just as I was about to turn back toward the garage, I spotted Rick, one of the foremen who had worked there for years. Rick was a guy in his 40s, with a gruff demeanor and a knack for fixing almost anything that came into the shop. He was wiping his hands with a rag, looking like he'd just come from a long job. "Hey, Rick," I greeted, trying to sound casual. "Where's Sarah? And Mike?" Rick froze for a brief second before clearing his throat. They're in the office," he replied, avoiding my gaze. His voice was low, almost hesitant, which was odd for a guy like him. Rick wasn't the type to mince words or play coy. I could feel my stomach twist as I processed his response. "In the office?" I echoed, trying to make sense of it. "What are they doing in there?" Rick shrugged, glancing around the shop as if he were looking for an escape route. "They've been in there for maybe an hour," he said, his tone filled with an awkwardness I'd never heard from him before. An hour? That didn't make any sense. What could they possibly be doing in a mechanic's office for an hour, especially with the car already fixed and parked outside? My heart pounded harder as I considered the possibilities, but I quickly pushed the dark thoughts aside. This was Sarah, my wife, the woman I'd built a life with. We might have had our arguments, our rough patches, but I trusted her. "Right," I muttered, more to myself than to Rick, as I moved toward the office door. I was trying to keep my breathing steady, trying to calm the surge of emotions that were now clawing at my chest. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe a long conversation about the repairs or a distraction of some sort. But deep down, an unshakable feeling of dread crept in, no matter how hard I tried to suppress it. The hallway leading to the office felt endless, each step echoing in the quiet space. I could hear faint voices from behind the door, muffled, as if they were whispering. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, hesitating. A small part of me wanted to turn around, walk away, and pretend that whatever was happening behind that door didn't exist. But I knew I couldn't. I had to know, had to face whatever reality lay on the other side. And so, with a deep breath, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The door swung open, revealing a scene that would be seared into my mind for the rest of my life. There they were, my wife Sarah and Mike, the man I'd trusted not only with my car, but as a fellow worker, a guy I'd even shared drinks with at the occasional after-hours meetup. But this time, there was no mistaking the situation. They were entwined, completely lost in each other, like two people who'd spent years together in a private, hidden world. Their laughter was soft, intimate, and I felt like an intruder in my own life. The sight of them was so surreal that, for a moment, my mind refused to process it. The office was a small, cluttered space, filled with Mike's tools and paperwork scattered everywhere. But amidst all that chaos, Sarah's familiar face was there, her expression utterly unrecognizable. There was no remorse, no hesitation in her movements. It was like she had completely forgotten the life we shared, her loyalty tossed aside for a moment's thrill. 1,000 thoughts ran through my mind. The memories of our marriage, our shared dreams, the life we'd built. All of it flashed before me in a whirlwind of disbelief. But underneath that shock, a deeper pain was brewing, a kind of betrayal that felt like a knife twisting in my gut. I wanted to scream, to rage, to demand answers. But the words stuck in my throat, held back by a numbness that seemed to spread through my entire body. I must have made a sound, or maybe it was just my shadow looming in the doorway, because they both turned to look at me. Sarah's face went pale, her eyes widening in horror as she realized what was happening. Mike's expression was harder to read, a mix of guilt, surprise, and maybe a hint of defiance, as though he were daring me to confront him. I took a step back, then another. My heart was pounding so loudly that I could barely hear anything else. Sarah jumped to her feet, her voice breaking as she called out my name, a mixture of shock and desperation in her tone. "Wait, please, it's not." But the words were empty, meaningless. I couldn't stay there another second. Turning on my heel, I left the office, ignoring her frantic calls and the pathetic excuses that she started to hurl in a futile attempt to justify what she'd done. Her voice sounded distant, like an echo that barely registered in my mind. It was as if she'd turned into a stranger in that instant, someone I'd never met, someone who didn't belong in my life anymore. The shop felt eerily silent as I walked through it, my footsteps heavy and slow, every step taking me further away from the reality that had just shattered around me. The foremen and mechanics were avoiding my gaze, looking down or pretending to be absorbed in their work. Wordless sympathy filled their eyes, and I realized that they'd probably known, or at least suspected, what was going on long before I did. It hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a betrayal by Sarah. It was as if everyone around us had been complicit, silently watching as my marriage fell apart while I remained blissfully unaware. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to confront every single person in that shop, to demand answers, to vent the rage building up inside me. But what good would it do? Nothing they could say would make a difference now. The damage was done, and I had to face the reality of what Sarah had become. I didn't even get into my car right away. Instead, I stood by the driver's door, taking deep breaths and trying to calm the storm raging inside me. I was shaking, a mix of anger, betrayal, and sheer disbelief coursing through me. How had it come to this? How had the woman I'd loved, the woman I'd built a life with, turned into someone I didn't even recognize? The memories of our life together started flooding my mind, uninvited and relentless. Our first date, the nights spent talking about our dreams, the plans we'd made for the future. They all felt like a cruel joke now, a series of empty promises that had been shattered in a single moment. I could almost feel my heart breaking, piece by piece, as the weight of her betrayal sank in. The drive home was a blur. I couldn't remember the streets I'd taken, or even how I managed to get there. My hands were trembling on the wheel, my mind clouded with a mixture of shock and pain. All I knew was that I needed to get out of there, to put as much distance as possible between myself and the life that had crumbled in front of me. I couldn't bear the thought of seeing Sarah again, of hearing her excuses, her lies. The woman I'd married was gone, replaced by a stranger who'd betrayed everything we'd built together. Once I got home, the silence was overwhelming. Our house, which had once felt warm and familiar, now felt like a hollow shell, a place filled with memories that were tainted by betrayal. I could still see traces of Sarah everywhere. Her shoes by the door, her favorite mug on the kitchen counter, the framed photo of us from our anniversary trip to the mountains. It was like she was haunting every corner of the house, a constant reminder of the life we'd shared and the trust she'd destroyed. I sat down at the dining table, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what had happened. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a cold, burning rage that threatened to consume me. This wasn't just some fleeting affair or a moment of weakness. This was a calculated betrayal, one that had taken place right under my nose, in a place I considered safe, with a man I'd trusted. As the minutes ticked by, my thoughts grew darker, and I realized that I couldn't let her get away with this. I couldn't just sit back and pretend that nothing had happened, that our life could somehow go back to normal. This was the end. There was no going back, no forgiveness, no second chances. The love I'd felt for Sarah was gone, replaced by a deep, seething anger that only grew stronger with every passing second. I knew what I had to do. Reaching for a pen and paper, I started drafting a divorce petition, pouring all my anger and hurt into every word. It was a cold, methodical process, but it gave me a sense of control, a way to take back the power that she'd stolen from me. I could almost feel the weight lifting from my shoulders as I wrote, as though each stroke of the pen was breaking the chains that had bound me to her lies. Sarah's betrayal had cut deep, but I wouldn't let it define me. I was stronger than that, stronger than she'd ever given me credit for. And as I finished the petition, I knew that I was ready to move on, to leave the pain and betrayal behind and start a new chapter in my life, one that didn't include her. But deep down, a part of me still ached for the life we'd lost, for the dreams that had been shattered in a single moment. And as I sat there in the silence, I couldn't help but wonder, was any of it ever real? Or had I been living in a lie from the very beginning? The next morning, I woke up in a house that no longer felt like home. The familiar walls, once filled with the laughter and warmth Sarah and I had shared, seemed cold and hollow, as if they, too, had been infected by her betrayal. My bed felt like an alien place, as though my own life had somehow become unrecognizable overnight. Every object in the room, a picture of us laughing on a beach vacation, a book she'd been reading, was like a dagger twisting in my chest, reminders of a love that had turned out to be a lie. I hadn't slept at all, and it showed in the hollow look in my eyes, the way my hands trembled whenever I reached for anything, whether it was the coffee mug or the pen sitting next to the divorce petition. I wanted to finish it, to send it to the lawyer first thing in the morning, but a small part of me hesitated. Not because I wanted her back. That bridge had burned the moment I saw her in Mike's arms, but because acknowledging it in writing somehow made it real, final. I needed to clear my head, to put some physical distance between myself and the memories haunting every corner of the house. Grabbing my keys, I left without a clear destination in mind. The morning air was crisp, biting at my skin, but it helped snap me out of the fog I'd been wandering in. I drove aimlessly, through streets we used to walk together, past parks where we'd sat for hours talking about everything and nothing, and finally, I ended up at a quiet coffee shop on the outskirts of town. There, in a small booth by the window, I sipped a coffee that tasted like ash in my mouth, staring out at a world that seemed to have gone on as if nothing had happened. People walked by, smiling, talking, laughing. They had no idea that my life had just fallen apart. It felt surreal, watching them go about their routines, unaware of the storm raging inside me. I wondered if anyone else in that coffee shop was dealing with the same pain, the same sense of betrayal that felt like it was consuming me from the inside out. As I sat there, lost in thought, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah. "Can we talk?" the text read. Simple, casual, as if she hadn't just destroyed everything we'd built together. I stared at the words, my hands clenched into fists, the rage bubbling up again, fresh and hot. The audacity, the nerve of her to ask for a conversation after what she'd done. What did she expect? An apology? An explanation? As if any words could erase the image of her and Mike in that tiny office, their faces filled with laughter and intimacy I'd thought was only ours. I wanted to reply, to unleash all the anger I'd been holding back, to tell her exactly what I thought of her and her pathetic excuses. But then, a strange sense of calm washed over me. No, I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. I'd given her enough of my time, my energy, my love. She didn't deserve another second of it. Ignoring her message, I put my phone away and turned my attention back to the coffee, taking slow, measured sips as I tried to push her out of my mind. But it was easier said than done. Everywhere I looked, I saw pieces of her, of us, reminders of a love I'd thought was real. My mind kept drifting back to the early days of our relationship, the long nights we'd spent talking, the promises we'd made to each other. Had any of it been real, or had I been fooling myself from the start? Hours passed before I finally made my way back home. The house felt even colder than before, the silence oppressive, a constant reminder of the life that had been shattered. I found myself wandering from room to room, picking up objects that had once held meaning, only to feel them slip through my fingers like sand. Everything felt empty, hollow, as if Sarah's betrayal had sucked all the life out of the place. In the living room, I found myself standing in front of our wedding photo. Her smile was radiant, her eyes full of love, or so I'd thought. Looking at it now, all I could see was a stranger, a woman who'd worn a mask of love and loyalty while hiding a heart full of deceit. My hands shook as I stared at the picture, a mixture of anger and sadness bubbling up inside me. In a sudden fit of rage, I grabbed the frame and hurled it against the wall, watching it shatter into 1,000 tiny pieces. The sound was loud, jarring, but strangely satisfying. It was as if, in that one moment, I'd finally broken free from the illusion I'd been living in. The lies, the betrayal, the heartbreak, all of it came crashing down, and I felt a strange sense of relief, as though I'd finally taken the first step toward moving on. As I picked up the broken shards, I realized that there was no going back, no undoing what had been done. Sarah was gone, the woman I'd loved replaced by someone I couldn't even recognize. And while the pain of her betrayal would linger, I knew that I had to let her go, to find a way to rebuild my life without her. Over the next few days, I threw myself into the process of untangling our lives. I contacted a lawyer, made arrangements to separate our finances, and began the painstaking process of dividing our possessions. It was exhausting, both physically and emotionally, but it gave me something to focus on, a way to channel the anger and hurt that still lingered beneath the surface. In those quiet moments, when the anger faded and the sadness took over, I found myself questioning everything. How had I missed the signs? Had there been red flags I'd ignored, moments when she'd pulled away, hints that she'd been unhappy? The self-doubt was a constant companion, a nagging voice in the back of my mind that refused to be silenced. I replayed every moment of our relationship, searching for answers, but all I found was more pain, more questions that would never be answered. Then came the day I had to pack up her things. It was the final step, the last tie that needed to be severed. I went through our bedroom, gathering her clothes, her jewelry, the little trinkets she'd collected over the years. Each item felt like a wound, a reminder of the life we'd shared, but I forced myself to keep going, to push through the pain. In the closet, I found an old shoebox filled with letters and photos, mementos of our early days together. I hesitated, my hands hovering over the box as a wave of sadness washed over me. Part of me wanted to throw it all away, to erase every trace of her from my life, but another part couldn't bear to let go of those memories. They were all that remained of the woman I'd loved, the life we'd shared, and letting go felt like losing a part of myself. After a moment, I closed the box and set it aside, a compromise between the past and the future. I couldn't erase what had happened, but I could choose how to move forward. And with each passing day, the weight of Sarah's betrayal felt a little lighter, the pain a little less sharp. By the time I finished packing, I felt a strange sense of peace. The house was empty now, stripped of the memories and the pain, a blank canvas waiting to be filled with new experiences, new memories. I stood in the doorway, looking back one last time before stepping outside and closing the door behind me. Sarah had taken so much from me, but she hadn't taken everything. I still had my life, my dignity, my sense of self. And as I walked away from the house that had once been our home, I knew that I was ready to start a new chapter, one free from the lies and betrayal that had haunted me for so long. The days following the final split from Sarah were oddly quiet, as if the whole world had paused in the aftermath. Though the initial shock and betrayal had dulled, I still felt the heaviness lingering in every corner of the empty house. Yet, something surprising began to creep in, a faint sense of relief, a glimmer of hope. For the first time in what felt like ages, I had my life back. No compromises, no obligations. Just me, alone with my thoughts and choices. It was terrifying, but exhilarating. With the paperwork signed, I didn't have to hear from Sarah anymore. Her texts had stopped, her messages pleading to talk things through dwindling into silence. My lawyer had suggested I avoid contact, and I'd stuck to that, a decision that spared me the mental whiplash of her shifting apologies and half-hearted attempts to justify her actions. As far as I was concerned, she was out of my life, her chapter closed. The initial numbness gave way to something else, a determination to reclaim parts of myself I hadn't realized I'd lost. Sarah had always had a way of filling every space in our lives, her influence subtle but pervasive. Our weekends were her plans, our trips her destinations, even our choice of friends or preferences. I hadn't noticed it happening. It was like being carried by a current, gradually swept away without realizing the shore was receding. One evening, as I was finishing up some work emails, a notification popped up on my phone. It was a group chat I'd been added to ages ago with my old friends, people I hadn't seen in months, some even years. I drifted away from them over time, caught up in the life Sarah and I had built together, a life where these friends had faded into the background. Seeing their names filled me with a pang of nostalgia, and on a whim, I replied to one of their messages. Within minutes, I was flooded with responses, the chat lighting up with jokes, memories, and inside jokes that I'd almost forgotten. They were planning a night out at our favorite bar downtown, and when they asked if I'd join, I didn't hesitate. It felt like something I'd been missing without knowing it, the company of people who knew me before the marriage, before the betrayals and heartbreak. That night, as I walked into the bar, I felt a strange mix of nervousness and excitement. The place was exactly as I remembered, dim lighting, the faint smell of beer and wood polish, music playing just loud enough to add to the ambience. I spotted my friends instantly, clustered around a high table, laughing and sharing drinks. When they saw me, they cheered, and within moments, I was enveloped in a mix of hugs, handshakes, and hearty pats on the back. We slipped into easy conversation, recounting stories from our younger days, tales of late-night escapades and misadventures that had become legendary among us. For the first time in a long while, I laughed without reservation, the tension in my shoulders easing with every passing moment. It was as if I was reclaiming a part of myself that had been buried under years of compromise and accommodation. I realized then how much I'd missed them. Amid the laughter, one of my friends, Mark, leaned over and clapped me on the shoulder. "You've been gone too long, man. Glad to have you back. You're free now. So, what are you going to do with all that freedom?" The question caught me off guard. What did I want to do? I'd been so focused on moving forward, on cutting ties with Sarah, that I hadn't thought much beyond the immediate future. But sitting there with my friends, I felt a sudden rush of possibilities. Maybe I could start doing things I'd always wanted to, but had set aside for one reason or another. Traveling, for one, I'd always wanted to visit the Grand Canyon, take a road trip across the states, explore the world beyond our little bubble. The night wore on, and eventually, we parted ways, promising to meet up again soon. I left the bar with a lighter heart, a newfound sense of purpose slowly replacing the bitterness that had settled there since Sarah's betrayal. Walking back to my car, I felt an odd sense of anticipation, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. It was like standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, ready to take the leap. The following morning, fueled by a renewed sense of motivation, I decided it was time to reclaim my house, to make it my own. I started with the bedroom, stripping it of anything that reminded me of her. I boxed up her belongings, the leftover trinkets and personal items she hadn't bothered to collect, and put them in the garage. Then, I painted the walls a fresh shade of blue, something calming and peaceful, a color I'd always liked, but that she'd vetoed as too boring. Over the next few days, I tackled every room, replacing furniture, adding pieces that reflected my taste and style, creating a space that was entirely mine. I even turned the small, neglected office into a music room, setting up a keyboard and dusting off my old guitar. Music had always been a passion of mine, something I'd let slip away over the years. And as I sat down to play, I felt a surge of energy, a release that words couldn't quite capture. During this time, I also reached out to my family, people I'd grown distant from as I drifted deeper into the world Sarah and I had built. They welcomed me back with open arms, my mother especially. She'd always been wary of Sarah, sensing something that I had missed, and though she didn't say "I told you so," I could see the relief in her eyes when I shared everything that had happened. There's something comforting about the unconditional love of family, the way they hold space for you even when you've drifted away. One evening, as I was working on a song in my newly reclaimed music room, I got a call from an unknown number. I hesitated, my stomach tightening as I thought it might be Sarah trying to reach me through another number. But when I answered, it wasn't her. It was Mike's wife, Lillian. Her voice was steady, calm, but I could hear the edge of heartbreak in her tone. "I know this is unexpected," she began, her words tentative. "But I needed to talk to someone who understands." In that moment, I realized I wasn't alone in my pain. Lillian had been blindsided, betrayed in the same way I had, her trust shattered by someone she'd loved and trusted. We spoke for hours that night, sharing our stories, our pain, and slowly, as we unraveled the mess our lives had become, a strange sense of solace blossomed between us. Lillian was gentle, kind, and resilient, a woman who had been broken but not defeated. Through our conversations, I felt a connection that went beyond our shared grief, a bond forged through mutual understanding and respect. Talking to her helped me process my own emotions, and in turn, I offered her whatever support I could. It felt good to be there for someone else, to shift my focus away from my own pain and offer comfort to someone who needed it. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself looking forward to our calls. We'd discuss everything, our lives, our dreams, the future we were now free to shape however we wanted. Lillian became a friend, a confidant, someone who understood the depths of betrayal and the strength required to rebuild from the ground up. One day, she suggested meeting in person. "Maybe it's time," she said, her voice carrying a note of hope. "Maybe we could start fresh, away from the shadows of the past." And as I hung up the phone that evening, I felt something stir within me, a cautious optimism, a tentative step toward a future unbound by the pain of yesterday. Our first meeting was, ironically, at a coffee shop across town, neutral ground, away from any lingering memories or reminders of our past lives. It was a small, cozy place with dim lighting, warm tones, and the faint aroma of roasted beans. I arrived a bit early, partly out of habit, partly because of the nervous excitement I hadn't felt in years. I sipped my coffee, trying to calm myself, mentally preparing for whatever might come of this encounter. When Lillian walked in, I recognized her immediately, even though we'd never met in person. Her appearance was striking, confident yet understated. She wore a simple blouse and jeans, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, her expression both guarded and inviting. She glanced around, spotted me, and for a brief moment, our eyes locked. We exchanged tentative smiles, two people who'd been through their own personal storms, coming together in the aftermath. "Hi, Lillian," I greeted, standing up as she reached the table. "It's good to finally meet you." "Likewise," she replied, a gentle smile spreading across her face. Her eyes held a softness, a hint of warmth that put me at ease. We settled into our seats, and for a few moments there was an awkward silence, as if we were both unsure how to begin. But soon, the words started flowing, tentative at first, then with increasing ease. We shared everything, our frustrations, our disbelief at how our lives had been upended by people we'd trusted. Lillian was refreshingly honest, not shying away from the details of her own heartache. She recounted how she'd found out about her husband's affair with Sarah, how it had shattered her, and how she'd struggled to keep herself together in the aftermath. I listened, feeling a connection to her that went beyond mere sympathy. It was as if we were bound by the same betrayal, both victims of our spouse's selfishness and deceit. After an hour, the initial tension gave way to a sense of familiarity. We laughed at the absurdity of our situations, finding humor in the small, ridiculous things that had once felt devastating. There was a moment when she looked at me, her expression both intense and vulnerable, and said, "Isn't it strange how life throws us together in such unexpected ways?" It was strange. Here we were, two people who had no reason to meet, no shared history, except for the tangled mess created by our ex's betrayal. And yet, sitting across from her, I felt a comfort, a peace that had been missing for so long. As we spoke, I found myself letting go of the bitterness that had clung to me since the day I walked in on Sarah and Mike. In Lillian, I saw someone who understood my pain on a level no one else could. Over the next few weeks, our friendship deepened. We met regularly, sharing meals, going for walks, or simply sitting together, talking late into the evening. Lillian had a calm presence, a quiet resilience that I admired. She'd been through hell, yet here she was, facing each day with strength and grace. It was inspiring, and in her presence, I found myself feeling stronger, more determined to rebuild my life. One day, after a long walk along the river, she invited me to her home for dinner. It was a small, modest house, nothing like the one she'd shared with Mike, but it had a cozy warmth that felt inviting. As we cooked together, a comfortable silence settled between us, the kind that comes from a mutual understanding, a shared experience. We moved around each other in the kitchen like old friends, our movements synchronized, our conversations easy and natural. After dinner, we sat on her porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange. It was a beautiful, peaceful moment, one that felt like a much-needed balm on the wounds we both carried. Lillian turned to me, her eyes soft and thoughtful, and said, "You know, I never thought I'd find myself here. I thought I had my life figured out." "Same here," I replied, nodding. Funny how life has a way of shattering all our expectations. She laughed, a genuine, heartfelt laugh that made me smile. Maybe that's not such a bad thing, she said. Maybe it's a chance to start over, to build something better. I looked at her, realizing how much she'd come to mean to me. She wasn't just a friend or a fellow survivor of betrayal. She was someone who'd become an anchor in the storm that had upended my life. In her presence, I felt whole again, as if the pieces of myself that had been scattered by Sarah's betrayal were slowly coming back together. As the days turned into weeks, our friendship deepened, and with it a quiet, unspoken attraction began to grow. It wasn't something we discussed or acknowledged openly, but it was there, simmering beneath the surface. I found myself looking forward to our time together, to the moments when we'd share a laugh or a quiet conversation. There was a comfort, a peace, in being with her, something I hadn't felt in years. One evening, as we were watching a movie at her place, she leaned against me, her head resting on my shoulder. The gesture was innocent, but it felt intimate, a small sign of trust and vulnerability. I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her closer, and for a moment, we sat in silence, our breaths synchronized, our hearts beating in tandem. In that quiet moment, I realized how much I cared for her, how deeply I'd come to value her presence in my life. She wasn't just a friend or a confidant. She was someone who understood me on a level that no one else could. And in her arms, I felt a sense of peace, a feeling of belonging that I hadn't felt in years. We didn't need to say anything, didn't need to define what was happening between us. It was enough to simply be there, to share in the quiet comfort of each other's presence. In that moment, I knew that I was finally free, not just from Sarah, but from the pain and bitterness that had haunted me for so long. The next morning, as I left her house, I felt a sense of clarity, a newfound purpose. I was ready to move forward, to leave the past behind and embrace whatever the future held. And as I walked away, I couldn't help but smile, feeling a sense of peace that had been absent from my life for far too long. The days with Lillian began to blend into a comfortable rhythm, one that felt like a balm on the remnants of pain I still carried. We didn't label what we had, didn't try to force it into something predefined. Instead, we let our connection grow naturally, one small step at a time. There was something liberating about it. Just two people, battered by life, learning to find joy in simplicity and in each other. We started spending more weekends together, doing everyday things that I hadn't realized I'd missed. We'd go grocery shopping, taking our time down every aisle, trading jokes about our food preferences. Or we'd go for long drives, escaping the city to the countryside, where we'd spend hours wandering through nature. It was a quiet life, simple but deeply satisfying, a life I'd never thought I'd cherish this much. One Saturday, Lillian suggested we tackle a home improvement project together, a spontaneous idea to repaint her guest bedroom. We spent the day moving furniture, prepping walls, and taping edges. As we painted, our conversations drifted from lighthearted banter to more personal stories, the kind of things you only share when you feel truly comfortable with someone. She opened up about her life with Mike, how it had started out so full of promise, only to deteriorate into something hollow. She shared memories of moments when she'd felt small, overshadowed by his ego, times when she'd stifled her own ambitions to support his ever-growing demands. It struck a chord with me because it echoed parts of my own experience with Sarah, how I'd sacrificed pieces of myself for someone who, in the end, only took more and more without giving anything back. As I listened, I felt a wave of empathy and respect for her resilience. Lillian wasn't bitter or angry. She'd somehow found a way to hold on to her grace despite everything. She turned to me as if reading my thoughts and said, "Sometimes we have to go through the worst to find the best in ourselves. Maybe that's why we're here now." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I nodded, knowing she was right. This journey hadn't been easy, but it had given us a clarity, a purpose we'd never had before. We both knew what it was like to be broken, and yet here we were, slowly piecing ourselves back together. Later that night, as we sat on her porch with cups of coffee in hand, I found myself thinking about the future in a way I hadn't dared to before. Lillian noticed my silence, and nudged me gently. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, her voice soft and inviting. I hesitated, not sure how to put my thoughts into words. "I guess I'm just wondering what comes next," I said finally. "This feels good, better than anything I've felt in a long time. But I also don't want to rush things, you know?" She nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "I feel the same. I think we've both been through enough to know that life can't be forced. Let's just let it be, see where it takes us. No expectations, no pressure." Her words were exactly what I needed to hear. It felt freeing, this lack of pressure, this mutual understanding. And in that moment, I realized that I'd found someone who didn't just fill a void, but complemented the person I was becoming. The following week, something unexpected happened. My younger brother, Ethan, reached out. We'd always been close growing up, but he'd moved to another state for work, and over time, our contact had become limited to holiday calls and occasional texts. It felt good to hear from him again, and when he suggested coming down to visit, I didn't hesitate to agree. When Ethan arrived, he brought with him a burst of energy that filled the house. He was like a whirlwind, asking questions, cracking jokes, and generally pulling me out of my comfort zone. He'd always had that effect on people, a way of making life feel a little more vibrant, a little less serious. And in his presence, I felt like I was reconnecting with parts of myself I'd almost forgotten. One evening, I decided to introduce him to Lillian. I wasn't sure how he'd react, but I trusted him, and I wanted him to know the person who had become so important to me. When he met her, he was instantly at ease, treating her with the same warmth and charm he reserved for family. And to my surprise, Lillian responded in kind, laughing at his jokes, trading stories, and sharing her own unique humor. Watching them interact was like seeing two pieces of my world come together, and for the first time in a long while I felt a deep sense of peace. The evening passed quickly, and as we sat around a table littered with empty plates and glasses, Ethan leaned back, a thoughtful look on his face. "You know," he said, looking between us, "I haven't seen you this happy in years. Whatever you two are doing, keep doing it." Lillian and I exchanged a glance, a small, knowing smile passing between us. It wasn't that everything was perfect. We both still carried scars, memories that would take time to heal. But we were learning to be okay with that, to accept each other with all our flaws and imperfections. After Ethan left, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I started tackling the things I'd put off for too long, reorganizing the house, getting back into old hobbies, even going to the gym regularly. Slowly, I was piecing together a life that felt authentic, a life where I could finally be myself. One day, while Lillian and I were out on a hike, she paused and looked out over the landscape, her gaze thoughtful. "Do you ever think about what you'd do if you could start over completely?" she asked. The question caught me off guard, but I thought about it for a moment. "I think I'd try to live more for myself," I admitted. For so long, I was living by someone else's expectations, molding myself into what they wanted me to be. But now, I want to find out who I am, who I really am. She smiled, a soft, knowing look in her eyes. "That's exactly what I was thinking," she said. "I think we both deserve that." Our lives settled into a quiet routine, a simple yet fulfilling rhythm. Lillian continued working on her own projects, exploring her passions with a newfound freedom that I admired. She'd always had a creative streak, a love for art and design, and watching her pursue that was inspiring. I started exploring my own interests, things I'd neglected over the years, photography, writing, even a bit of gardening. One evening, as we sat in her backyard, watching the stars emerge in the night sky, I realized that this was what happiness felt like. Not the kind of happiness that comes from grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but a steady, quiet contentment, a sense of fulfillment that ran deeper than the temporary thrills of our younger years. And in that moment, I understood that maybe, just maybe, we'd both found what we were searching for all along, a place to belong, a person to share our journey with, and the courage to face whatever lay ahead. As our connection deepened, so did our plans for the future. Lillian and I started talking about long-term goals, quiet dreams we'd both shelved for too long. She'd always wanted to open a small art studio, a space where she could teach painting classes and let her creativity flourish. Meanwhile, I'd begun to consider starting my own business, something I'd always wanted but hadn't pursued, distracted by Sarah's ambitions instead of my own. Yet, with every step forward, the shadows of our past seemed to linger just out of sight, reminders of the wounds we'd worked so hard to heal. We'd been careful not to dwell too much on the betrayals that had brought us together, focusing instead on building something fresh and new. But the ghosts of our previous relationships lingered, not as obstacles, but as cautionary reminders. One evening, as we were sitting together on my couch, reminiscing about old dreams, I sensed a hesitation in Lillian. Her laughter had a brittle edge, her gaze wandering as if lost in thought. After a moment, she admitted, "Sometimes I worry, that maybe I'm still not enough. Like, what if there's something in me that drove Mike away?" I reached for her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Lillian, that wasn't you, that was him. He made his choice, and it had nothing to do with your worth. You were more than enough. He just couldn't see it." She sighed, her fingers tracing patterns on the back of my hand. "I know, logically, but some days it's hard not to carry that insecurity." Her words hit close to home because I knew exactly what she meant. No matter how much time passed, the self-doubt from our broken marriages had a way of resurfacing, reminding us of our insecurities. We'd both been scarred, and while we were healing, those old wounds had a way of reopening when we least expected it. The next day, the past came crashing back in a way we hadn't anticipated. While grabbing a coffee downtown, I ran into Sarah. It was inevitable, perhaps. Our town was small enough that avoiding her completely had been unrealistic. But still, seeing her again brought a wave of mixed emotions, feelings I thought I'd left behind. She was standing by the counter, her familiar posture and mannerisms a stark reminder of the years we'd shared. When she noticed me, her eyes widened, and for a moment, there was an awkward silence. She looked different. Not physically. She still had that poised, polished look she'd always maintained. But there was something in her expression, a weariness, a vulnerability I'd never seen before. "Hey," she said finally, a faint, tentative smile crossing her face. It's been a while." "Yeah," I replied, keeping my tone polite but distant. I didn't know her anything, yet a part of me felt compelled to hear her out. "How have you been?" She hesitated, then let out a soft sigh. "Honestly, not great. I know I probably don't deserve it. But could we talk? Just for a few minutes?" Reluctantly, I agreed, hoping that a brief conversation would give me closure. We found a small, quiet corner in the cafe, and she began talking, recounting how her relationship with Mike had quickly deteriorated. What she described was a mirror image of my own experience. The fights, the broken trust, the relentless dissatisfaction. As she spoke, I felt a strange mix of emotions, vindication, pity, and a lingering sadness. She was the one who had shattered our life together, and yet here she was, realizing the weight of her mistakes. There was a part of me that wanted to say something sharp, something that would make her feel the pain she'd caused me. But I knew it wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't erase the hurt, nor would it bring me any real satisfaction. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought I knew what I wanted, but I was wrong. I hurt you, and I don't think I'll ever forgive myself for that." Her apology was long overdue, yet it stirred a strange sense of relief. Maybe it was the closure I hadn't realized I needed, a way to finally let go of the bitterness that had lingered for so long. When I got back to Lillian's place that evening, she noticed a change in my demeanor immediately. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her brow furrowed with concern. I took a deep breath, then recounted my encounter with Sarah. Lillian listened quietly, her expression thoughtful, and when I finished, she reached out, wrapping me in a gentle embrace. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "It takes strength to face the past like that." In the days that followed, I noticed a change in myself. I felt lighter, as if a weight I'd carried for years had finally been lifted. I hadn't realized how much I'd let the bitterness from my marriage hold me back, clouding my view of the future. With Sarah's apology, however belated, I felt free, truly free for the first time. Lillian and I continued our journey, but now, our connection felt even deeper, unburdened by the shadows that had once haunted us. We began making real plans, discussing our dreams in earnest, laying the foundation for a future we both wanted. One evening, over a quiet dinner at her place, she looked at me, her eyes soft and serious. "I've been thinking maybe it's time I open that studio. It's something I've always wanted, and now, well, I think I'm ready." I reached across the table, taking her hand in mine. "Then do it, Lillian. Don't let anything hold you back. You deserve this." Encouraged by my support, she began planning in earnest, sketching out ideas for the studio, scouting potential locations, and creating a vision for the space. Watching her passion reignite was inspiring, a reminder of the strength and resilience that had brought us both to this point. At the same time, I found myself diving into my own plans, researching the logistics of starting a business, reaching out to contacts, and mapping out a potential path forward. It was invigorating, this feeling of working towards something meaningful, something that was entirely my own. We became each other's biggest supporters, cheering each other on with every small victory, every step forward. And through it all, our bond deepened, the connection between us growing stronger with each passing day. But even as we embraced this new chapter, we knew the journey wasn't over. The scars from our past were still there, reminders of the pain we'd endured. And while we'd made great strides in healing, we understood that true closure would take time. One day, as we were taking a break from our respective projects, Lillian turned to me, a contemplative look in her eyes. "Do you ever think about forgiveness?" she asked. "Not just for them, but for ourselves?" Her question caught me off guard, but as I considered it, I realized she was right. Forgiving our exes was one thing, but forgiving ourselves was another. We'd both been carrying a sense of failure, a guilt for not seeing the warning signs, for allowing ourselves to be hurt. I think it's time we let go of that too," I replied. "We did our best. Maybe it's time we forgive ourselves and move on fully." And in that quiet moment, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a calm that I hadn't experienced in years. We were no longer defined by our pasts, no longer held captive by the mistakes and betrayals we'd endured. Instead, we were moving forward, together, toward a future we were both building, one step at a time. Things felt peaceful, almost too peaceful, as Lillian and I continued building our lives together. Our routines were settling in, and the excitement of planning our new ventures gave each day a sense of purpose. I'd thrown myself into the early stages of starting my own contracting business, putting in long hours to set everything up, while Lillian had leased a cozy studio in town to start her art classes. We shared long nights planning, excited and grateful for the path we were forging. But, as life has a way of doing, our newfound stability was about to be tested. Just as we were getting comfortable, both of us started facing unexpected complications in our respective dreams. The problem started with my business. I'd partnered with an old acquaintance, Rob, a contractor I'd known for years and trusted. We'd worked together when I was first starting out in the trades, and I thought he was the perfect fit. But almost immediately, red flags started to appear. Rob had always been a bit of a risk-taker, but now it felt like he was going out of his way to make careless decisions, cutting corners, skimping on materials, and ignoring safety protocols. It wasn't long before it became clear that his primary concern wasn't quality or reputation. It was profit. One afternoon, I got a call from a client who was furious about the subpar work we'd done on a small renovation. It was a job Rob had managed on his own, and when I went to inspect the site, I realized the extent of the shortcuts he'd taken. The walls weren't insulated properly, the electrical work was sloppy, and even the materials he'd used were substandard. I tried confronting him, explaining that this wasn't how I wanted to operate, but he brushed me off. "Come on, man," he said, flashing his usual cocky grin. "You gotta learn to let some things slide. We're here to make money, not waste it on high-end finishes." The conversation quickly turned into an argument, one that left me with a sinking feeling in my gut. I'd risked everything to start this business, and now it was jeopardized by someone I thought I could rely on. Walking out of the meeting with Rob, I felt the weight of the decision looming over me. Should I continue this partnership or cut him loose and go it alone? The idea of starting from scratch again was daunting, but so was the prospect of compromising my values. As I wrestled with these questions, Lillian was facing her own set of challenges. Her art studio had opened just a few weeks prior, and initially, the classes had been a hit. People loved her relaxed teaching style and the chance to experiment with painting in a no-pressure environment. But soon enough, she began noticing that a small group of students, regulars who'd initially seemed enthusiastic, had started disrupting her classes. They'd arrive late, talk loudly during her instructions, and even critique her style in a way that felt more like mocking than constructive feedback. Lillian tried addressing the issue directly, asking them to be respectful and considerate of the other students. But her efforts only seemed to make things worse. One day, they showed up with canvases of their own, filled with amateurish caricatures that poked fun at her teaching. They'd smeared crude versions of her recent paintings, laughing as they displayed their work for everyone to see. The worst part was Lillian didn't feel she could confront them without risking her budding reputation. Word of mouth was critical in a small town, and she feared they might spread negative rumors about her business if she pushed back too hard. So, she kept quiet, swallowing her frustration and doing her best to rise above the insults. One evening, as we sat in her living room, Lillian finally broke down. "Maybe I'm not cut out for this," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe I was stupid to think I could actually make a career out of art." The defeat in her tone struck a chord deep within me. I knew what it felt like to doubt yourself, to wonder if your dreams were worth pursuing. I wanted to comfort her, to remind her of her talent and resilience. But part of me was struggling with my own sense of failure. Rob's betrayal and the setbacks in my business weighed heavily on me, leaving me feeling as though I was no longer the strong, dependable partner I'd once been. As we talked, I sensed a shift in our relationship. The comfortable, easy connection we'd shared in the beginning now felt strained, as though the weight of our individual struggles was pushing us apart. It was as if the closer we got to achieving our dreams, the more the cracks in our relationship started to show. That night, as we lay in bed, I felt a wall between us, an unspoken tension that neither of us wanted to address. We were both struggling, each of us caught in the whirlwind of our own insecurities and doubts. I wanted to reach out, to tell her that we could get through this together, but the words felt hollow. How could I promise her anything when I was grappling with my own failures? The next day, things took an unexpected turn. I was in my office, going over paperwork, when I received an email from one of the clients Rob and I had worked with. They'd had their own inspection done after our renovation, and the report was damning. Electrical wiring was exposed, the drywall was uneven, and there were clear signs of water damage that had been painted over rather than properly addressed. As I read the report, my anger toward Rob boiled over. This was beyond careless. It was reckless. I couldn't allow my name to be associated with work like this. I called Rob, determined to end our partnership, but he didn't answer. Frustrated, I left the office, heading to his place to confront him in person. When I arrived, he answered the door with a dismissive expression, already knowing why I was there. We argued, voices raised, and in the heat of the moment, he let slip that he'd been planning to leave the business all along, just as soon as he'd made a profit. To him, it was nothing more than a quick cash grab, a way to make some fast money before moving on. I left his place, seething, knowing I had no choice but to cut ties with him. But as I drove home, the reality of my situation hit me like a tidal wave. I was back at square one, with a damaged reputation and no partner to share the workload. The idea of rebuilding from scratch felt overwhelming. And for the first time since I'd started this journey, I questioned if I had the strength to keep going. When I got home, Lillian was waiting for me, her face lined with worry. She'd had a rough day too, dealing with another incident with the disruptive students, and when I told her about my confrontation with Rob, the tension between us finally erupted. We argued, each of us venting our frustrations, our words sharp and defensive. "You're not the only one struggling here," she snapped, her voice breaking with emotion. "I've been dealing with this nightmare at the studio, and all I get from you is silence. You're so wrapped up in your problems, you don't even see what I'm going through." Her words stung because they were true. In my focus on my own issues, I'd overlooked the toll her struggles were taking on her. And as I looked at her, I realized that we'd both been so focused on our individual battles that we'd forgotten what had brought us together in the first place. Taking a deep breath, I reached for her hand, pulling her close. "I'm sorry, Lillian. I've been selfish, and I didn't mean to make you feel alone. We're supposed to be a team, and I've let you down." She looked at me, her anger softening as she held my gaze. "We've both been so caught up in trying to make everything perfect that we forgot we don't have to do it all alone." In that quiet moment, something shifted between us. We'd both been brought to our lowest points, forced to confront our deepest fears and insecurities. But in each other's arms, I realized that maybe, just maybe, we had the strength to get through this together. After that difficult night, something changed between Lillian and me. The anger and frustration we'd held back came spilling out, clearing the air in a way we hadn't realized we needed. We weren't suddenly healed, and our issues hadn't disappeared, but now we were both on the same page. For the first time in weeks, we faced our problems openly, acknowledging that the road to our dreams might not be as straightforward as we'd imagined. The following morning, I called in to terminate my business partnership with Rob officially. It was a hard blow. Losing a friend and partner was painful enough, but his actions had nearly derailed everything I'd worked for. Over the next few days, I went into damage control mode, reaching out to clients one by one, explaining the situation and promising that I'd personally oversee any corrections. Some clients were understanding, though hesitant, while others were outright angry. But I made my way through each conversation with a humility I hadn't known I was capable of. As I navigated this storm, Lillian faced her own internal battles. She couldn't let those mocking students disrupt her passion, and she knew that standing up for herself was a challenge she'd avoided for too long. After a lot of late-night talks and practicing in front of the mirror, she finally built up the courage to address them directly in her next class. It was tense, and the confrontation wasn't easy. They sneered as she spoke, cutting her off with sarcastic remarks, but Lillian held her ground, surprising even herself. She calmly explained that her studio was meant to be a positive and supportive environment, and if they couldn't respect that, they were free to leave. There was silence when she finished, and although the students left, she felt a sense of victory. For once, she had asserted her boundaries, choosing to honor her art and integrity over the fear of conflict. Back home, we celebrated the small victories together. My progress with the clients, Lillian's stand in her studio. They weren't huge milestones, but to us, they felt monumental. It was as if, in overcoming these challenges, we were finding a new depth to our relationship, a strength that hadn't been there before. But things took an unexpected turn the following week. It happened one evening while I was at the office, sorting through invoices, when I received a call from an unknown number. Expecting another client, I answered, only to be met with the voice of someone from my past. Kendra, an old friend from high school. The years had created distance, but her voice brought back a flood of memories. We talked, catching up briefly, before she got to the reason for her call. She was facing a family crisis. Her father, who had been a mentor to me back in the day, had fallen ill, and she was reaching out to old friends, hoping to gather support. The conversation struck a nerve, pulling me back to a simpler time when life hadn't been so complicated. I agreed to meet her for coffee the next day to see how I could help. After all, her father had been a huge influence on me, one of the reasons I'd chosen the trades. I'd practically grown up in his workshop, learning skills I used every day. Telling Lillian about the coffee meeting with Kendra felt oddly difficult, though I couldn't explain why. She seemed supportive, but gave me a look that lingered, as if sensing something more than I could articulate. Meeting with Kendra stirred a lot within me. As we sat across from each other in the small coffee shop, memories flooded back. Laughs, youthful ambitions, and shared dreams. She had a calmness, a way of making everything feel less urgent, that I'd once admired. The conversation was easy, nostalgic, and surprisingly refreshing. She told me about her life, how she'd moved away, married, and eventually returned to town when things didn't work out. Listening to her, I realized how much time had changed us both, but there was an undeniable familiarity that felt oddly comforting. I returned home that evening with mixed emotions. Lillian was waiting for me, and though I felt a need to tell her everything about my meeting with Kendra, I found myself hesitating. Instead, I offered a vague summary, brushing over the details, something I immediately regretted. Lillian noticed, of course, and though she didn't press, I could see the tension building between us again. The next few weeks were marked by a subtle strain. My work was still a mess as I tried to rebuild my business's reputation, while Lillian continued struggling with her confidence. And then there was Kendra. We'd agreed to meet up a few more times to organize support for her father, but every time I mentioned her name, I noticed Lillian's expression tighten. I understood her discomfort, but it didn't feel fair. Kendra and I were just friends, after all. I was simply trying to help an old mentor's family. But doubt crept in, gnawing at the back of my mind. One evening, after another exhausting day, Lillian confronted me. Her voice was soft but tinged with vulnerability as she asked, "Do you miss her?" Her question hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just about Kendra. It was everything we'd been through recently. In a moment of weakness, I admitted, sometimes I miss how simple things used to be. Life felt easier back then. The words hung in the air, and I saw the hurt in Lillian's eyes. She didn't argue, didn't accuse, but the look on her face said more than any words could. In that moment, I realized I'd allowed myself to slip into a dangerous mindset, one that was distancing me from the life we'd built together. From that night on, I made a conscious effort to put Kendra aside and refocus on Lillian. She was the one who'd stood by me through the worst of it, and the one I truly loved. Our life might not have been easy, but it was real, and that was worth more than any fleeting nostalgia. The final push came when I received an invitation from Kendra to her father's hospital bedside for a goodbye visit. Part of me wanted to go. After all, he'd been like family to me. But I couldn't ignore the impact it would have on Lillian. She hadn't asked me to choose, but I knew it was time I did. Standing in the hallway, looking at Lillian curled up on the couch, a realization washed over me. I couldn't keep one foot in the past while trying to build a future with her. I declined the invitation, sending Kendra a heartfelt message of support instead. It wasn't easy, and a part of me ached at the decision, but I knew it was the right one. I explained everything to Lillian, laying out my decision, and for the first time in weeks, I saw her relax. We were both hurt, both scarred by recent events, but we were finally truly on the same path. Over the next days, we made a conscious effort to reconnect, to find joy in the small, simple things that had once drawn us together. We took walks, shared dinners without talking about work or problems, and slowly, that tension began to fade. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. In those quiet moments, I realized something profound. The challenges we'd faced hadn't broken us. They'd reshaped us. We weren't the same couple who'd first fallen in love, but that was okay. We were growing, evolving, and in learning to navigate our hardships, we were building a resilience that would carry us through whatever life threw our way. It's funny how life works sometimes. You think you've hit rock bottom, only to realize that it's just a pit you need to crawl through to reach higher ground. I used to believe that everything would go according to plan, that with enough hard work, dedication, and a little bit of luck, things would always work out. But the truth is, sometimes it's not about having control. It's about letting go and trusting the process. I had no idea where my marriage to Lillian was headed after everything that happened. For months, we danced around our issues, trying to fix things that felt broken beyond repair. But there was one thing I learned through all of this. Healing doesn't happen in straight lines. It's messy, it's complicated, and sometimes it takes a lot longer than you think. When I walked into the house after declining Kendra's invitation, it felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The air was different, lighter, almost as if we were starting anew. Lillian was sitting on the couch, the TV on low in the background, her eyes flicking between the screen and me. I could tell she was waiting for something. She hadn't said much since I told her about Kendra, but I could feel the questions hanging between us, unspoken. I sat down beside her, and for a few moments, neither of us said anything. The silence was comfortable, like a long-held breath waiting to be released. Finally, she spoke. "You made the right choice," she said softly, her voice steady but laced with vulnerability. "It wasn't easy for you, was it?" I shook my head. "No, it wasn't. But you're right. It was the right choice." She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes searching my face, as if trying to gauge whether I truly meant what I was saying. "I just want us to be okay again. I don't know if we can go back to who we were before, but I'm willing to try if you are." Her words hit me like a tidal wave. I had spent so much time focusing on what was wrong, on the things we'd lost, that I hadn't realized how much we still had. I didn't need to go back to the past. I needed to embrace where we were now, the love that still existed, even if it was a little bruised. "I'm willing to try, too," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I don't want to lose what we have. I don't want to give up on us." Lillian nodded, her lips trembling as she held back tears. It was strange how much weight those words carried in that moment, how much they meant to both of us. It felt like we had both been holding on to so much anger, so much resentment, that we couldn't see the love right in front of us. But now we could. We spent the next few days talking, really talking, about our fears, our disappointments, the things we had buried beneath the surface. We didn't have all the answers, but we were both determined to find a way forward. We decided to take a break from the stress of work and school, to disconnect from everything that had consumed us for so long, and just focus on each other. We spent quiet evenings in the backyard, grilling dinner and talking about things that had nothing to do with our problems. It wasn't always easy, but it was real. As time passed, things began to shift. Slowly, we began to rebuild. Lillian grew more confident in herself and her studio. She started teaching new classes, embracing the changes that had once seemed so overwhelming. She even hired a new assistant, someone who was as passionate about the art as she was, and it took a load off her shoulders. I, on the other hand, continued to patch up my business, focusing on repairing the damage Rob had done. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. But the most important part of our journey was what happened between us. Every night, before we went to bed, we would make it a point to talk about something positive that had happened during the day, something that made us smile, something that reminded us why we were still together. It was simple, but it worked. Slowly, we learned to appreciate each other again, to remind ourselves that despite everything that had gone wrong, we were still here. Then came the day when things truly started to feel like they were falling into place. It was a Saturday morning, and we had planned to spend the day together, just the two of us. Lillian had a full day of teaching, and I had a few errands to run. We hadn't had a proper date in months, so we decided to make the most of the day. We took our time getting ready, doing small things like making coffee together, teasing each other over which song should play on the stereo, and just enjoying the moments that had become so rare. After I finished my errands, I stopped by the small park near our neighborhood. It was the same park where we had first met all those years ago. I had planned something special for her, something to show her how much she meant to me. I returned home with a bouquet of flowers and a small gift, a handcrafted journal. Lillian had always loved writing, and I thought it would be a meaningful way to show her that I saw her, not just as my wife, but as her own person with her own dreams. When I walked in, I found her sitting on the couch, reading a book, a soft smile on her face. For a moment, I just stood there, watching her, amazed at how beautiful she looked, how much she had grown through everything we'd been through. She looked up and smiled when she saw the flowers. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her voice gentle but full of warmth. But I could see the light in her eyes. The love that had been buried deep beneath the surface was finally starting to shine through again. "I wanted to," I replied. "For you. For us." We spent the rest of the day together, reconnecting in a way we hadn't done in a long time. We talked about the future, about our plans, about the things that still scared us, but that we were ready to face together. We both knew that we weren't the same people we had been when we first met. But that was okay. We didn't need to be. We had something better now, a deeper, more enduring connection, forged through hardship and strengthened by our willingness to grow. As we lay in bed that night, I felt a peace I hadn't known in months. Everything wasn't perfect, but I was finally at a place where I knew I could face whatever came next as long as we were together. And that was enough. In the end, we both realized that sometimes life isn't about the destination. It's about the journey. We've fallen apart, yes, but we had also found our way back to each other. and that was worth more than anything we had ever imagined. We had a second chance, and this time, we were determined to make it count.